So the Randal cycle explains a lot. And one of the biggest things that it explains, amongst other things, amongst other explanations, is how it is that, you know, half the world is now obese, because the diet of half the world over the last 100 years has become so carb centric. Well, I'm wondering, just curiously, is there anything we can do to avoid this situation in the first place? Well, yes.
Malcolm, how did you find Carnivore?
It came at the end of quite a long journey. I found it in 2020. I discovered, I think it was the book, The Carnivore Code by Dr. Paul Saladino. But, where did I really start? And, well, I'm 65 now. I was born in 1959. In 1970, I've always had an interest in nutrition and sort of maintaining a healthier lifestyle. And in 1974, you might remember the Pritikin diet came out. And my parents went on the Pritikin diet. And that sort of got me interested in healthy living, a healthy, trying to treat food as something more than just fuel for the body. And so then throughout the 80s, 70s and 80s and 90s, I met my wife. We had a couple of children. We raised them on the, you know, the low fat, high carb diet. We were fairly sort of, I wouldn't say zealous, but we paid heed to the advice of the day. And we were, you know, I did a lot of cooking. My wife did a lot of, we used to share the cooking, and we were, you know, careful to cut all the fat off the chicken. Yeah, so we were very low carb, very low fat and high carb, as we all were. And at the time, this was around about 2008, I was quite a keen weight trainer. I wouldn't say bodybuilder, but certainly weight training. And I was very active. I used to play tennis and run, you know, had to take the dog for 5K runs. And I was quite fortunate. I was sort of semi-retired, and I had a lot of time to devote to exercise. And to motivate myself, I remember buying a magazine, one of those natural bodybuilding magazines. And there was an article in there that said, in order to grow muscle, we needed to also not just eat protein, but EFAs. And I thought, what are EFAs? Never heard of them. And I did some research, and they turned out to be essential fatty acids. And so then I did some research into essential fatty acids and discovered that what they were really talking about was saturated fat. But of course, the mantra at the time was saturated fat would kill you. But I was really intrigued that from a nutritional perspective, in order to grow muscle, we had to eat saturated fat with our protein. Now, fast forward nearly 20 years, and I now understand that we need saturated fat with protein because it helps the protein digest in the stomach and in the small intestine. And in nature, particularly in animal meat, animal foods, animal-based foods, protein always comes with fat. So a T-bone steak, whatever. So in nature, protein doesn't come with fat other than perhaps in nuts. And you sort of have to query whether or not nuts are actually human food. But anyway, given that, you know, I was really intrigued. They're telling us to eat fat, but I know that's going to kill me. So that sort of kick-started this whole journey into what if eating saturated fat is not harmful? Because what I've looked at nutrition from this logical perspective, right? And let's assume for the moment that, yes, they were right. You need saturated fat to properly digest protein. Well, if that is the case, then what else in our diet? What other dietary advice might be either mistaken or incorrect or misleading. So the first rabbit hole I went down was the saturated fat rabbit hole, and I discovered Nina Teicholz's book, The Big Fat Surprise. And I read that, and she debunks the notion that saturated fat is harmful effectively, and that it causes heart disease. And that really got me then interested in this whole area of nutrition and what else was wrong. Now, there's an Australian by the name of David Gillespie who wrote a book called Sweet Poison, and that's his take on the harmful effects of sugar. And then he wrote another book called Toxic Oil, which is a book on the harmful effects of polyunsaturated oils. And he was very much ridiculed by the mainstream sort of scientific community because he was a lawyer. He wasn't a scientist. But I'm not a scientist either, and I'm not a doctor. But I've got an inquiring mind, and I was happy to listen to what he had to say in his books, because he said, look, I'm only a lawyer, I'm not a scientist, but I can understand scientific principles, I can read scientific papers, and I can draw a conclusion, from my reading. And so when I sort of read his books and I read Nina's books, next thing you know, as you can imagine, we're going down rabbit holes left, right, and centre. So then the next book that I discovered was William Davis's Wheat Belly, and here's a cardiac surgeon. So here he is saying, look, wheat is not necessarily good for you. It contains gluten and it impacts your intestines and it leads to leaky gut and so forth. So I'm thinking, okay, well, we can eat saturated fat. We shouldn't eat sugar. Dr. Davis is telling us not to eat wheat. And at the time, because I live sort of in a regional area, we didn't have a very good internet connection. So I didn't have access to YouTube. But I somehow came across Mark Sisson, Sisson, and Mark runs I think he's got a website, and I think I visited his website, and he introduced me to Mark Hyman, Dr. Mark Hyman. Now, Mark Sisson was promoting sort of an ancestral diet at the time, as was Dr. Hyman. And it was while I was looking at Mark's website that there was a link to another website called the Perfect Diet. Now, the Perfect Diet website is run by Paul Geminet and his wife, and they wrote a book called The Perfect Diet, Perfect Health Diet, sorry, get it right. And this was in 2017. So I was very much interested in the notion that an ancestral diet would be appropriate for modern humans. And because I knew, as everybody does, that we've only been agricultural for about 10 or 12,000 years. And so I picked up this book, The Perfect Health Diet, and I was very impressed with it, because the first thing they did was look at our ancestry and then determine what, in their minds, in their view, was an appropriate diet for humans based on our ancestry and our anatomy and things of that nature. Now, in a nutshell, what they recommend is that we eliminate wheat and grains and pulses, essentially. So you can eat vegetables, you can eat fats, and you can eat fruits, and you can eat some nuts and small amounts of things like alcohol and chocolate and so forth. But the essence of it is dump the grains. So that was sort of almost like a paleo diet. And so I bought the book and adopted that diet, and I was really quite happy with the results. And the more the sort of 2017, 2018, the longer I stayed on that diet, the more I started to realize that there were foods that we didn't necessarily need, because they, like we weren't eating very much sugar, and we weren't eating grains, bread, pasta. So we sort of we lost quite a few things. We lost all the pastas, and my wife and I were big pasta eaters back in the 80s and 90s. And we lost, now you could eat rice and potatoes. So rice and potatoes were still on the menu, but you had to cook them and then cool them in the fridge and then sort of reheat them the next day. And we were perfectly happy to eat rice and potatoes, but I'd already sort of really now get quite into this sort of diet business. And somehow, I don't know how, because once you start, you can't stop. Next thing you know, I was investigating keto, right? And I came across sort of the whole ketogenic world, and particularly by now, by 2019, we'd got better internet connection, and I discovered YouTube. So by 2020, when COVID came along, we were mucking along doing our perfect health diet, and I discovered Low Carb Down Under, which is a big website that promotes low carb living, and started watching some of the videos. And I started to then really investigate whether or not we should be eating potatoes and rice and the other vegetables. And of course, this led me then to Sally Norton and the investigation into oxalates. Also that the American cardiologist who identified lectins, I can't remember the name of the book, but he identified lectins as being fairly toxic or harmful, and his name escapes me at the moment. And then I came across Paul Saladino, and I read his book, The Carnivore Code, and I was quite struck with sort of the logic of it all, right? And that then caused me to go down that rabbit hole. And I've spent now, here it is 2024, I've spent the last, nearly 4 years investigating, and I've watched, thousands of videos. But it's the logicality of the diet that really strikes me, right? And in my profession, I read a lot of death certificates. And now I can't help, when I go to the death certificate, I go to the cause of death, right? And I can see now practically everybody dies of complications from an inappropriate human diet, right? So, where do we start? So where do we draw the link between what is an appropriate ancestral diet, and how do we determine that, and what's the evidence of that we see today, and where that would lead us to a conclusion? So we'll probably tick them off one by one if you like, but the first and most striking thing is the design of the human body. And so I'm going to be making some sort of fairly global statements, but at the end of the day, people can do their own research and come to their own conclusions. But humans were, without a doubt, the top predators over the last 7.5 million years. We've sent practically every major species extinct. We've hunted every large animal to extinction practically. It's a miracle the elephant survived. And they did that. Our ancestors did that in search of fat and protein. Now, the anatomy of the human body is such that our hips allow us to be bipedal, and our shoulders allow us to throw over our shoulders, therefore throw a stone or a spear, enabled us to hunt. And there's anthropological evidence that our hips had developed into bipedal hips 7.5 million years ago. So if that is the case, we've had a hell of a long time to develop as hunters. The most striking difference between humans and every other mammal on Earth is the size of our brain. And the expensive tissue hypothesis explains how it is that we evolved a brain as big as it is. It takes 25% of the energy each day, but it only represents 2% of our mass. So it is an exceedingly expensive organ in terms of energy. So somehow we evolved to develop this very, very complex brain when other animals didn't. And the explanation for that is that we evolved on fat, which is 9 calories per gram, as opposed to carbohydrates at 4 calories. So the explanation is that our ancestors accessed fat, more than likely bone marrow and brains of other animals, and with access to this higher energy density nutrient, our ancestors were able to have energy to spare to evolve a brain. I think one of the fundamental mistakes that people make is looking at our ancestors who were effectively tribal and living in relatively small tribal groups as being dumb and dumber, right? And I like to look at the American Red Indians as a fairly good example of what I think our ancestors of who our ancestors really were. They followed the bison. Now, we know there was something like about between 20 and 50 million bison in America when the Westerners were starting to work their way across the United States. The American Red Indians lived basically following the bison for centuries that we know of, thousands probably. I haven't really done the research, but when you think about it, they lived in a teepee. They were effectively nomadic or mobile, and they just followed their food source. Now, they couldn't, put down roots and stay in one spot because the bison were wandering off down the prairie. I can imagine that our ancestors did exactly the same thing. Now, if all they needed was meat and fat, well, then that's all they needed to do. They didn't need to put down roots and build homes and cities and complex communities and all that sort of business, because they needed to be mobile and they needed to follow their food source. So, but that didn't prevent them from growing a brain. That's the whole point. They weren't stupid. They just didn't need to build complex communities like we have today. Now, on that point, the only reason that we've been able to build complex communities and stay in the same place is because we discovered, or were forced to discover, agriculture. Right. Now, I've never heard anybody say this, but it's my view that the reason why we turned to agriculture was through necessity and not through desire. I'm not sold on the idea that our ancestors preferred to grow grains, wheat in particular. My view is that they had no choice, that it was either that or starve. And that makes sense if they were hunting their food sources to extinction. So anyway, we were the top predators, and there are plenty of evidence out there to suggest that we were. What was our food source? Well, what was our fuel source? Our fuel source was fat and protein. Now, I know everybody says, oh, look, you can metabolize protein for energy. I understand that, but I don't think that's the human body's preference. And I think the reason why we succeeded was that we had access to fat. I don't think our ancestors ran around sort of chasing kale and, looking around for tiny little tubers to dig out of the ground. And if you've got a choice, if I've got a choice between a T-bone and a piece of kale, I think I'm going for the T-bone. And I think our ancestors did the same thing. Now, if Professor Bart Kay has got very interesting views on the matter, and I'm sure I think you might have interviewed Bart, Professor Bart, if I might call him that, and he mentions the Randal cycle. And along my journey, there were two sort of facts that finally convinced me beyond all doubt that a carnivore diet is an appropriate diet. And the first was the Randal cycle, where Professor Barth says that if we eat fat and carbohydrates at the same time, they cross-interfere with the metabolism of the other, which then leads to the cell being hungry. So the cells then starve in a sea of fuel, and the fuel's in the blood. We've got fat in the blood, we've got glucose in the blood, and the cell is having difficulty taking up either. Right? Now, that sort of makes sense because historically, I believe, our ancestors had very little access to carbohydrates, and we had no need to evolve a system that would permit our body to access both glucose and fuel and fat easily and appropriately. So now the naysayers, this always cracks me up. The naysayers will say, well, Malcolm, there are plenty of cells in your body that rely on glucose, so there needs to be a pathway, blah, blah, blah. And I understand all that, but also I'm led to believe that the body can make as much glucose as it needs, so there's no need to ingest any. And if there is no need to ingest any, then it's my assumption that the amount of glucose that would normally be in our blood as a result of self-production will not be so much as to interfere with the metabolism of fat, if fat is the preferred fuel. So it's just completely illogical to consider that we evolved to metabolize fat for fuel and to manufacture glucose as we require it, and then to conclude that the glucose would necessarily interfere with the metabolism of fat. Like, to me, that just can't possibly be a logical conclusion from 7.5 million years of evolution. Right? So the Randal cycle explains a lot. And one of the biggest things that it explains, amongst other things, amongst other explanations, is how it is that half the world is now obese, because the diet of half the world over the last 100 years has become so carb centric. So the Randal cycle to me is really the first really sort of provable, scientifically provable, according to Professor Barth, provable conclusion that humans did not evolve to run on glucose. Right? Now, the second most fundamental thing that I came across was Dr. Rick Johnson's book, Nature Wants Us to Be Fat, and the human relationship with fructose. Because whenever you talk to anybody, they say, "Oh, Malcolm, what about fruit? Surely our ancestors, had access to fruit," and this is true. But Rick explains that about 5 million years ago, we underwent a genetic mutation, which, as I understand it, and I stand to be corrected, but this is my understanding, that effectively prevented the humans, and that's all of us now, from metabolizing fructose for energy, right? So whenever we eat fructose, back in the day, our ancestors would stumble across a ripe fruit tree towards the end of summer, coming into autumn, and would gorge on the fruit, as we all would, because it's very sweet and it's fructose and we like it. And then that fructose would immediately be effectively stored as fat, transformed into fat. And it's their ability to fatten up on fructose that enabled them then to survive the long cold winters, the long hard winters when there was no fruit, and perhaps some of the animals that they normally would be hunting might be there or fewer in frequency. So this ability then to store fructose as fat gave an advantage to our ancestors, and it explains our relationship with fruit. That's the whole point. what I take from that is an explanation. Okay, all right, I wondered about, fruit. Well, maybe, Malcolm, we should be eating our fruit every day. Well, yes, if you want to get fat. Otherwise, no. there's no real need for it. So the Randal cycle and our relationship with fructose really started to sort of provide some explanations as to and put a bit of fat around the theory, if I can say that. Right. Now we can start looking further afield, and this is why we can now say, well, okay, if what's the benefit of eating fat, or put it the other way, what's the benefit of avoiding carbs? Well, where do you want to start? Practically every Western world disease can be attributed to inflammation, and that inflammation can be caused, or we're starting to point the finger now at excessive blood sugar levels and excessive insulin, and the toxic effects of omega-6 fats, right? Polyunsaturated fats. But again, let's just have a look at blood sugar, because this cracks me up, right? If we have high blood sugar, we go to our doctor, and our doctor prescribes some insulin, and so that'll bring it down. And I'm looking at blood sugar from a completely different perspective. We all know that the body prefers blood sugar to be at a set level. The body will automatically maintain its salinity and the blood sugar level and all that sort of business, and it does it without us having to input anything. It does it automatically. So apparently we have 1 to 2 teaspoons of sugar in our blood at any one time. We know unequivocally, like this is sort of beyond scientific dispute, that if we eat some glucose or sugar and raise our blood sugar, if we don't do anything about it, we will die. That's what children used to die of back in the old days. Type 1 diabetics who couldn't get access to insulin would die of complications from excessive blood sugar. And we can die quite quickly, like within 24 to 48 hours. So it, to me, is completely illogical to conclude that something that we can eat that will put our blood sugar into a toxic state can be properly considered to be food, because it's completely, again, counterintuitive to imagine that over 7.5 million years we evolved to eat foods that would kill us unless our body implemented an emergency program. Now, that emergency program is insulin, right? And when you get into insulin, you learn that the primary role of insulin is not to reduce blood sugar. The primary role of insulin is to shunt nutrients, energy and nutrients, into cells. So it's a growth hormone, and they even call it a growth hormone. So a growth hormone's primary role is not to reduce sugar in your blood. Logically, a growth hormone's primary role is to help you grow. So as soon as we eat some carbs, we get a blood sugar spike, we get some insulin released, and insulin does its best job to clear the blood of the sugar. And how does it do it? It shunts that sugar into the cells. Now, if we do this chronically over decades, we can develop insulin resistance, which is an explanation. Basically, the cells are having difficulty taking up the glucose, so more and more insulin has to be produced until such time as we can't reduce the blood sugar, and all of a sudden we need exogenous insulin to do the job. Well, I'm wondering, just curiously, is there anything we can do to avoid this situation in the first place? Well, yes. Don't eat carbohydrates, because fat and protein don't give rise to an insulin spike that is in any way toxic or harmful to the body. Now, Professor Ben Bikman is the expert on insulin, and he will tell you that that we can't grow without insulin. So it is a growth hormone, but if we have too much insulin, then this can give rise to problems. Now, there's a great book by, I've got his name here, see if I can find it for you, by James Clement, called The Switch. Now, James, again, is not a scientist, but he is a lawyer, actually. I tend to read books by lawyers. But he is a weekend scientist, I think, a weekend science warrior. And he identifies the difference between mTOR and autophagy. So effectively, the human body will adopt one of two states. There's no such thing as the status quo. We will be either growing or we'll be dying, right? So if we're growing, we're in a growth state. So, and Ben Bikman will tell us, well, you're growing because you've got insulin present, and that insulin is shunting energy into your cells, right? If if we're sort of if we haven't eaten for a while and we don't have very much energy in the blood, then we switch over to autophagy, where the body will say, well, okay, there's nothing coming down the digestive system. We're going to have to now tap into our reserves, and the next thing you know, the fat cells are releasing energy into the blood, and away we go. So this business about mTOR and autophagy again makes anthropological sense, right? Our ancestors would have eaten up big, and then perhaps not eaten for a day or 2 days or 3 days or 4 days. And again, there are case stories of Westerners coming into contact with the tribes 300, 400, 500 years ago, and these are the reports that they gave, that today we eat, tomorrow or the next day we may not eat. Now, if we want to, so it seems to make sense that eating and then a little bit of fasting might be good for the human body. And how do we know whether or not this is the case? Well, apparently human growth hormone peaks after 48 hours of fasting. Well, what can we take from that? Well, if we eat and then we fast for 48 hours, the human body is ready to eat again after 48 hours and do something with the food. So we now know that during the 48 hours, if we are experiencing autophagy, then basically our cells are having a big clean out. There's a bit of renovation going on, they're putting out the rubbish, and they're getting, and there can be not just renovation, but regeneration, right? But particularly when you break the fast, that's when new cells evolve. So if you look at it from the perspective of everybody knows, and here's something that's sort of really intuitive. Everybody knows that you're sloughing off skin cells all the time. So the girls do it. They take the dead skin cells off their face all the time to improve their appearance. So that means that at the other end of the spectrum, new cells must be coming on the scene. And this is exactly what happens. So apparently, practically every cell in our body can be renewed. And I read somewhere that your heart cells get renewed 4 times throughout your life. Your skin cells get renewed probably every 3 or 4 days. Now, we need to provide an opportunity for all this to take place. And as we understand it, all this will take place much more effectively and efficiently if we fast. So if we eat and fast, eat and fast. And of course, this makes this makes logical sense, because in the past our ancestors would have hunted down a wildebeest, feasted, and then perhaps they didn't have fridges, they didn't have Woolies down the road, they didn't have a supermarket. They would have just chowed down, eaten practically everything they could, and then in another couple of days the women would have been poking them and said, boys, time to get on your horse and go and do it again, right? The ketogenic state. So if we don't eat for a while, we enter what's called a ketogenic state, where, as I understand it, the liver processes fat and releases ketones into the blood, and the cells can then use ketones as energy. Now, there's no evidence whatsoever that the ketogenic state is toxic or harmful. And in fact, we're starting to see evidence now that quite to the contrary, when people have all sorts of illnesses, whether it be autoimmune disease or autoimmune issues, or whether it be dementia, heart disease, whatever, when they go into a ketogenic state and stay there for a while, they often report significant improvements. Well, what's the message from that? Well, your body prefers to run on ketones as opposed to what you were running on previously, which almost certainly included, carbs and seed oils. So we know that a ketogenic state is non-inflammatory is the best way to put it, which means the opposite is more than likely true, and that is that when we eat carbs and we eat seed oils, then we're putting the body into a state of inflammation. Now, if you drill down on this leads to some interesting hypotheses. In my mind, because I'm only a layperson, that I treat them practically as a fact, but I know all the scientists out there will say, oh, it's not proven. But in my mind, there's a very strong correlation between excessive blood sugar, excessive sugar in the mitochondria, right, and cancer. Now, if there's I've got to think of his name, Dr. Thomas Seyfried. Oh, you've got to get him on the channel. He is the guru on the metabolism of cancer cells, right? Now, this will blow people away if they haven't discovered Professor Seyfried's views on the matter. He spent a good part of 30 years in studying cancer cells. If we have cancer, the way of discovering that we do have cancer is to inject us with a radioactive substance that's very high in glucose, and inject it in. The glucose gets taken up by the cancer cells, and then we can see them on a PET scan. Well, Professor Seyfried explains that cancer cells can only metabolize glucose and glutamine for fuel. They cannot metabolize fat or ketones. So one way of addressing a cancer is to starve the cells to death. Now, all you have to do is go on a fast and reduce the intake of glucose and glutamine. Now, apparently, glutamine is a protein, and it's very difficult, if not impossible, to avoid when you eat food. But there are protocols that Professor Seyfried and his colleagues have developed that can maximize the reduction of glutamine, such that you can reduce to the extent possible the fuel for the cancer cells. Now, he has got many anecdotal and case, N of 1 cases where people have treated their cancer without harmful radiation and without chemo, or in a combination of a bit of radiation or a bit of chemo and this sort of diet protocol, very, very successfully, right? So So now the point that I want to make is not so much, look, you can go and treat your cancer. Like that's a bonus. The real point is, well, where does the cancer come from, right? And everybody thinks that cancer is a genetic disease. But he says, no, I'm not buying that. He says the cancer comes from an inability of the cell to metabolize energy in its mitochondria. So the mitochondria are chugging away, trying to, and I've got to go back one step because people need to properly understand how cells function. And I'm not an expert, so this is very much a layperson's take on things. But every cell in our body has a function. It has to do something, right? And in order to do something, it needs to generate energy. So the human body is like a car. It has a petrol tank and it has an engine. Now, the petrol tank contains the fuel, and the fuel is converted by the engine into energy, and it's the energy then that can move the car, right? So the mitochondria are the engine. The mitochondria have to take the fuel, convert it into energy, and then the cell can perform its function. If the mitochondria are forced to metabolize glucose because our blood sugar is constantly too high, and insulin is constantly forcing the sugar to be shunted into the cells eventually revolt. They say, I've had enough of all this, and they start to shut down the metabolizing of energy, right? The metabolism. All of a sudden, the cell is starting to go hungry, and the cell doesn't want to die, and it reverts to fermenting glucose for fuel, as opposed to respirating glucose or fat for fuel, as it was designed to do. So we have a complete change in the way in which the cell creates energy. Instead of instead of using oxygen and going through the process called respiration, which you'll have to get a scientist, far more informed on this matter than me to explain. All I know is we swap over from burning oxygen to now fermenting glucose. Now that is a cancer cell. So as soon as the cell starts fermenting glucose, it's now cancer. And it's got nothing to do with genetics, and it's got everything to do with the inability of the cell to respirate. And Professor Seyfried's take on things, as I understand it, is that comes from a chronic insult from glucose itself, from the very substance that it was trying to burn, right? Now that sort of makes sense because 100 years ago, cancer was very rare, and all of a sudden cancer is all over the place. Why? And in fact, it's going to become the #1 killer of people within probably the foreseeable future, without a doubt. And why would this be so? Because in our typical modern diet, we just can't help but poison ourselves with glucose. Go through all those, one by one, and it just, the bone keeps getting pointed at the modern diet and the glucose. Now, there are all sorts of anecdotal things that are difficult to explain. For instance, my wife's a teacher in a primary school, and the children, 7, 8 years old, they're so disrespectful. Their attention span they can't last 10 seconds. They've all got ADHD. We have now in schools teachers' aides, we used to call them in the old days. We have teachers' aides now whose sole function is to sit with, a child, little Johnny, and help him through his day at school because it's so stressful and he can't handle it and all this sort of stuff, right? I watched a very interesting video on one of these gentlemen who went and lived with the Hadza or some African tribe, for 6 weeks. And he said that the children were just so well behaved, laughed, happy, they didn't fight, they cooperated, they played together, blah, 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 right? And you don't see that in modern children, right? The children today, they're all sooks. There was something wrong with them. Now, why would this be so? Look at what they have. Cocoa Pops for breakfast, some sugary treat for morning tea, carbs for lunch, carbs for afternoon tea, Smith's crisps or something when they get home, biscuits, whatever it is. And then they'll eat pasta or KFC or Macca's for dinner. And the poor little things are poisoned from sun up to sundown. And they wouldn't know protein if they fell over it. Now, in relation to these African tribes that people like to refer to and say, oh, look, they eat 547 different plants, and and they're not really carnivore. They eat a very wide variety of foods. I'm thinking to myself, yeah, I would too if I was them, because they've been pushed into a corner of Africa where practically nothing lives, and they're eating whatever protein they can get their hands on. And I was watching a video, one of the tribes was eating baboons. That was their primary protein source. And I'm thinking to myself, the poor things, I'm sure they don't really want to kill a baboon. They'd rather kill a wildebeest, but they can't get the wildebeest because there aren't any there. So they're forced to eating baboons, for God's sake. So I don't buy this business, that you need a variety of foods. And that brings me to another interesting point. The human gut, right? And I read this book, I've read a few books on the gut, and I understand that at the moment there's a big push to eat sort of fermented foods and prebiotics and probiotics and all that sort of stuff. And I'm thinking to myself, really? What did our ancestors eat, right? So I think from my reading, there are conclusions being drawn in relation to the role of the gut in human health, and the variety of microbes that you should have, and bacteria and so forth in your gut. I think there are conclusions being drawn that are not necessarily borne out. My view is that if we eat a species-appropriate diet, and I like to sort of refer to Professor Bart and say, I agree with him, we should eat a species-appropriate diet. If we eat a species-appropriate diet, we will evolve the bacteria that we need. If you don't eat anything else, you won't need anything else. Now, I know if I stray, I feel the effects the next day, right? Because I don't have the bacteria to deal with what I just ate the day before, right, or 48 hours earlier. So I've lived the experience, we all have. But that doesn't mean that I need to go out and eat kale and crap like that just to maintain some bacteria. Like, seriously? Now, in relation to the design of the human body, I mentioned, our anatomy, but what I didn't mention, and this also cracks me up, right? And I may be wrong. I'm happy to be proven wrong, but just bear with me here. Our digestive system is designed to digest fat and protein. Number one, right? That's from chewing to swallowing to into their very acidic stomach, then into our small intestine, which just happens to be 27 feet long, right? Which is very long. And then finally, it pops into our large intestine, which is only 3 feet long. Now, as I understand it, the only place where you can actually ferment anything to create fatty acids is in your large intestine. And I've read that if we relied on our large intestine for fatty acids energy, we would only produce 7% of our daily energy needs. So if we didn't eat sugar, right? If we didn't eat sugar, and we relied on the carbs to be fermented in our large intestine, we'd starve, right? If we eat sugar, we get that instant energy because it's half fructose, half glucose. It doesn't carry any nutrients, but it's energy, and that goes straight into our bloodstream, and all of a sudden our cells can metabolize the glucose for energy, right? So if this is why I've noticed, you talk to any woman who's gone on a diet, when they take the sugar out of their diet, they lose weight straight away. Well, it's easily explained. First of all, we're not metabolizing that glucose anymore, so you're giving your cells a break and they can hack into the fat. And secondly, you're eliminating the fructose from your diet, well, part of the fructose from your diet, because you're eliminating the fructose that's part of the sugar molecule, right? So that explains how it is that they're not storing fat because they're not eating fructose, and they're also burning fat because they're not eating sugar. So if you go on a diet, the best thing to do is just to eliminate the sugar. Now, so we're talking about the anatomy of the human body, right? We're not cows. We can't really ferment foods for energy. But the interesting thing is every mammal does, right? So cows and other animals like sheep and so forth, as I understand it, they ferment the fibre in the grass and the foods they eat to create short, medium and long chain fatty acids. So they don't actually function on carbs. They function on fatty acids. Well, that's what we should do. We function on fatty acids as well, except we don't have to ferment them. We can go and kill them, chop them up and eat them, and they're called cows. Right? So the whole design of the human body, of the digestive system, points to a human appropriate diet or food being fat and protein. Now, this makes sense when you also look at it from the perspective that we lost a great part of our digestive system over the millennia so that we could grow a large brain. So we had to, in order to grow a large brain, we had to get rid of some of our guts. So what did we do? Well, we swapped over, we transitioned to eating a more nutrient-dense food. Now, this is the next thing, right? Meat is nutrient dense. Like, I haven't seen anybody point to meat and say, oh, it's lacking in something or anything. But you look at sugar, it's got zero nutrients. You look at, potatoes, they got bugger all. You look at your standard, Big Mac, Coke and fries. Like, the only bit that is remotely worthwhile is the patty, and that's only a small part of the meal. The rest of it is extremely energy dense. Don't get me wrong, there's a lot of energy there, but it's just, it's nutrient deficient. So if you go back to the children, the primary school children, the secondary school children, it's my view that they are malnutritioned, right? And I don't think, nobody ever gets tested. How do you know if you're malnutritioned? You wouldn't know because children don't get tested. But when you look at what they eat compared to if they were to eat 300 or 400 grams of meat in a day, as compared to 300 or 400 grams of carbs, like, it's just a no-brainer. So much more protein. So their diets, the typical Western diet is practically devoid of protein and other nutrients. Now, the pundits will say, well, go and get your veggies. Get your veggies. Oh, do you mean I have to go and get my oxalates, my lectins, my toxins and my anti-nutrients? Oh, I can't wait for that, right? So,
where, like, it is pretty scary when you think that all these kids are just surviving from, as you say, dawn to dusk on carbohydrate. Where do you think this is going?
Well, that's why I came on your on your show. Basically, I can't see it changing. I say I can't see it changing within the next 20 years, right? Basically, we end up preaching to the converted, right? You and me, because because people are so brainwashed by the propaganda that you need to eat a heart healthy diet, eat your healthy whole grains and your veggies and your fruit. And if I tell people that I'm carnivore, they're almost horrified, and very few people have an open mind, right? So I've got a doctor, and I was talking to him about small, dense VDL, LDL. Yeah, small, dense, low density lipoproteins, and he laughed. He couldn't stop laughing, and he said, "There's no such thing," right? So, sugar. When we get excessive blood sugar, we get excessive. It's very, very confusing. I've gone down 3 or 4 different rabbit holes over this LDL business, and your sort of your blood lipids profile, and I think there are differing views, but as best I can understand it, if we eat too much sugar and too many seed oils, then we end up with glycated particles, which are effectively sugar-coated particles or particles of sugar. It's very hard to understand because I'm not a lipidologist. And oxidated particles in our blood. Now, basically, it's easier to understand that we end up with stuff in our blood that shouldn't be there. Now, this stuff ends up inflaming our arteries, and typically the arteries in and around the heart, and apparently there's some sort of intentional design for that to occur. Now, this is then what becomes plaques, or heart disease, whatever you want to call it. And this is caused by sugar and seed oils. And when you take the sugar and seed oils out, then the body can repair itself, the arteries can repair themselves, the macrophage cells can come in, clean away all the bloody detritus, and Bob's your uncle, right? But when I tried to now the modern doctor is obsessed with your cholesterol levels, and I had to thank Dave Feldman. And have you interviewed Dave Feldman yet?
I have, yes.
Yeah. And but basically, like, if we've got too much sugar in our blood, the liver produces triglycerides, so the triglycerides level goes up, and these triglycerides are released as VLDL, very low density lipoproteins, and they travel around and drop off their cargo, which is fat and other nutrients, to cells. And as they drop off their fat and nutrients, they become smaller and denser, and so they transform from VLDL, very low density lipoproteins, to IDL, intermediate low density lipoproteins, to LDL, low density proteins. Then when they're LDL, on their spectrum, they should normally typically go back to the liver and be recharged, go back out, do another cycle, courier of deliveries. If they go back, if they are damaged by glucose or oxidative particles in the blood, when they go back to the liver, they get rejected, and now they stay in circulation. And the lipoprotein profile of elevated LDL has been historically linked with heart problems or heart disease. cardio problems. Now, this is not necessarily an untrue or false correlation. Everybody's going, yeah, we understand that. But the point is that, well, not all LDL, high levels of LDL, will give rise to complications. It comes down to what the profile of that LDL is. And the more glycated and the more oxidated, the more damaged the LDL, the smaller the particles become and the denser they become. And it's the ratio of small, dense LDL to total LDL that is what we want to know, and that's what you don't find out on your lipid profile. So when your doctor says your LDL is too high, you need to ask, well, yeah, what part? Right? And the doctor won't be able to tell you, but apparently you can get a test. But to go back to your original question, the fact that I know that, but my doctor doesn't know that, is very disappointing, right? And so here in Australia, we have now, and I'm sure that they're developing around the world, a class of doctor called functional doctors. And if we want to try to speak to somebody on a similar intellectual level in relation to all of this whole subject, you need to go and talk to a functional doctor who's either done the research like we have, or is far more open to alternative treatments or alternative approaches. Yeah, but they're very few and far between. So there are not that many. But so to answer your question, when am I going to? We're not going to see any change until they change the curriculum in uni. And I just read the other day that the textbooks are 20 years behind the times, and the profession is 10 years behind the times. So 10 years behind current knowledge, right? So and the textbooks are not necessarily written by people who know, right? They're written by people who write textbooks. And how many textbooks, have we been inspired to write? Like not very many. So just because some bloke wrote a textbook doesn't mean he's the authority on the subject. And there are plenty. And if you talk to Gary Fetke, have you interviewed Gary?
Yes. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Gary's got some things to say about textbooks and what's in them. Yes. So, but I can't see it changing other than through a groundswell. But the other problem that we face is that people think eating carnivore is very expensive. So meat's not cheap, and it's much cheaper to feed a family with $1.50 worth of spaghetti than $30 of meat. So that's the other thing too. If you go to a restaurant, the most expensive part of a meal is the protein. So if you go to restaurants now, you should have a look at their menu, and you'll see that 90% of it are carbs. So they'll have pastas, they'll have pizza, they'll have anything that doesn't have meat in it because they can't afford the meat.
Yeah, the profit margin's in the carbs, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And people can't afford to put too much meat on the menu or in the dish because the people can't afford to pay for it. Like if they were to put a proper amount of protein in every dish, it would send the cost of the dish up. So in order to make sales, they have to keep the cost down. And the easiest way to do that is to fill it up with carbs and useless veggies.
So day to day, how have you been eating, Malcolm?
Since 2020, I typically fast until about 11 o'clock. I have 2 meals. My wife and I have only 2 meals a day. I have fasted all the way, 24-hour fasts, but I normally start to feel a bit hungry about 11. So I'll get up in the morning, exercise in the morning, then I'll come to work. I'll have some meat, pre-cooked meat, So I cook in advance. So I might, if I cook some lamb chops, I might cook a dozen lamb chops. I've typically got cooked meat in the fridge ready to go at all times. So it could be steak, it could be leftover steak, it could be lamb chops, it could be roast lamb, it could be sausages, it could be hams, it could be anything. And I bring a little lunch pack, and I'll have that at lunchtime. And then I won't eat again until dinner. And I have, if I feel like a snack, I'll have a bit of cheese. So I have a bit of cheese at home and another pack of cheese at work. So I might just have a bit of cheese at 3 o'clock if I'm feeling a bit peckish. At the start, I did notice that it was a bit, it did take a bit of transitioning to go to only 2 meals a day and to wean myself off the carbs, right? But the longer you do it, everybody says it, but the longer you do it, the easier it is. And I can go a whole day without eating. And I had a day once, and I was with a client, and it wasn't carnivore or anything, but we were chatting away in a quiet moment, and we hadn't eaten, and it was about sort of 12 o'clock. And I said to him, well, look, you better duck off and get something to eat. And he says, oh, no, I'm not eating today. And I said, why not? And he said, I fast every Wednesday, right? And it was a Wednesday. I said, oh, okay, righto. Well, I didn't want to, I can't remember if I had lunch with me that day or not, but I thought, well, he's not eating, so I won't eat. And, we both went the whole day together. We didn't eat, and we didn't show any ill effects for it. And now I can get up and go and do something and find myself in a situation where I haven't eaten, and I'm not likely to eat, at any time soon, and it doesn't bother me in the least. I just chug along.
Such an empowering feeling, right?
Oh, absolutely. And not a slave to food, and not a slave to a schedule, not a slave to a timetable. It makes it a little bit difficult socially, I have to say. I've had a daughter that was vegan. Then she went carno, and now she's gone back to sort of almost normal. Sad diet. Oh, poor thing.
Those are some pretty extreme swings, vegan to carnivore.
Yes. Yeah. Yep. Oh, that's what they do.
Yeah. So, if you were recommending this to someone, how would you recommend they get started with carnivore?
I recommend the very first thing they should do is eliminate wheat, right? Just take one thing out of your diet, and if that thing should be wheat, which would be, you can say to them, eliminate sugar, but they won't, and that's the hardest thing for them to give up. That's it's the hardest thing for me to give up. Right? But if you tell them, look, just take one thing out of your diet and just get rid of that, because if you look at it, wheat, potatoes, and rice, they are the three staples, right? And of those three staples, wheat is the most harmful. So, and if they could do that, then they might be able to carry on. But everybody says you have to have a why, right? And it's a very difficult thing to sell, the why, because you're not, unless you've got some medical condition that is affecting you right now, which most young people don't have, right? Most adults right up until their sort of 40s, they muck along. They don't think they have anything wrong with them. They don't need to address anything, right? And it's only the rare person that will make serious changes fairly early in life, banking on the benefits manifesting later. But in my case, I deal with a lot of people who have dementia, or I can see dementia in them and they don't even know it. And I'm going, I'm not going to be like you. So my two greatest fears were dying of a heart attack. And when I turned 50, I went and saw the quack and said, what do I have to do? And he said, nothing. You're the fittest 50-year-old that ever sat in that chair, right? And I thought, okay, and that took me down the Nina Teicholz, rabbit hole. So I sort of, okay, I'm not going to die of a heart attack. Well, the next greatest risk then is to develop dementia, right? Or die of cancer or dementia, right? Well, cancer, I'm not worried about cancer. I'm not even worried about cancer even if cancer is discovered, because I have a pretty fair idea on how to deal with it, right? And once you know how to deal with it, it takes the worry away. And if you also have a view on what you can do to prevent it, oh, Bob's your uncle. So right now, I've completely changed my approach to life, right? Most people would think, well, if I hit 85, I'll be happy. And if I can have a reasonable quality of life between, say, 65 and 80, right, I'll be happy with that. No. I'm going for 100. So I want a really good quality of life until I'm 90, maybe even 100. You might want to Google Gary Player. Gary Player is, world-class golfer, and Gary is 90 and playing to scratch. 90, playing to scratch. You should Google him. He's the man. And I'm thinking, if Gary can get to 90 and play scratch, I can get to 90 and play golf. I don't have to play to scratch, but I can still play golf. So I'm thinking to myself, 65 is the new 45, right? And why not? When we look at the examples of people who have treated themselves fairly poorly for most of their lives and then turn their life around at 70 or 71 or 75, and they, their blood lipids are perfect and they're feeling good and they look good, and you're thinking, well, there I go.
So Malcolm, is there a way that people can reach out to you? Do you have a social media account or a YouTube or anything?
No. They can email me if you've got my email address. I'm happy to answer emails. Yes.
Sure.
Yeah. I'm happy to help because I can't see this changing without people helping.
Awesome. So I'll put your email in the show notes.
Okay.
Malcolm, thank you so much for coming on and sharing so much useful information and easy to understand information with us. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you. I'm sorry I rattled on a little bit.